Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Elire Treasury Experience. We're so excited you joined us for day 2, and hopefully you enjoyed the sessions yesterday. Again, my name is Jordan Fuger-Burmeister, and I'm the Marketing Manager at Elire. Before we get going, a couple quick reminders. We do still have that hashtag ETE2020 LinkedIn and Twitter giveaway. Engage with us, and you're entered to win a $200 Amazon gift card. We'll be doing that drawing later today. All session recordings and links to the CTP CCM credit assessments will be sent out early next week. And finally, all attendees are on mute, but are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A as well as the chat to presenters. With that, we'll get into our first session of the day, the evolution of payments, ISO and SWIFT, with Mr. Mike Kapala. Mike is a senior treasury consultant with Elire and has advanced skills in Kyriba, Oracle Cloud, and PeopleSoft TMSs. Mike is a lead in our Treasury Software as a Service practice with expertise in banking, cash management, bank connectivity, ERP integrations, and payments. With that, we will turn it over to Mike. Hold on one moment.
Thanks for the intro, Jordan. Can you hear me okay?
We are good to go. Thanks, Mike.
All right, perfect. Sorry for the technical difficulties there. Once again, thank you for the intro. Just a quick agenda of what we'll be going over today. So I'll start with just an Elire introduction and some of our industry experience. Then I'll really dive into everything payment related and ISO related. So I'll discuss some just general payment trends that we're seeing in the space today. And then move into everything related to ISO 20022. So what is ISO? A quick SWIFT ISO adoption study. So where the space was, basically how and why ISO was founded, and when, and how it has progressed throughout the last several years, and where it is heading for the future. And then for all the attendees on the phone, some tips on how to prepare for the ISO enablement. So how to move forward and just some thoughts to consider as time progresses to adopt ISO on your end. And then we'll conclude with a couple project examples related to ISO that we've done here at Elire and some of the subsequent ROI and TCO benefits. And then finally, to wrap up, we will host a Q&A session. So for starters, just a few tidbits here about Elire. We are celebrating 15 years in business. We were founded in 2005. We really pride ourselves on being a trusted advisor to our clients with over 250 plus TMS and roadmap engagements. So we obviously help our clients by partnering effectively to implement software, but not only that is we provide strategic roadmap guidance with best practices in core business and treasury processes. So obviously, acting as subject matter experts on the software side and the implementation, but also being there for our clients to give them advice on how they're conducting business and items that may be able to help them gain efficiency and save some time and costs. And then finally, we have a deep commitment to excellence and quality as one of our core values. And you can see, obviously, some of our partnership logos there on the right side of the screen. Moving on to just highlight a couple of our treasury practices here at Elire. So first, our treasury advisory services practice. So more on the, like I mentioned, business process improvement. We have a service for PMP certified resources where we outsource project management work to our clients. TMS RFP vendor selections, so helping clients go through the analysis process and analyzing several different TMS solutions and helping them determine which will best suit their business needs. Bank services rationalization, making sure that our client's bank account model and just banking structure in general is in place and effective for their business and their processes. And then finally, like I mentioned, our best practice process improvement and making sure that our clients are utilizing their software and all the tools at their disposal to the best of their advantage. Moving to more of the implementation side, we have our ERP implementation services regarding Oracle, PeopleSoft, and Oracle EBS. And then on the cloud side and more of the treasury niche, we have partnerships with Kyriba, FIS, obviously the Oracle Cloud Cash Management Module. And then also talking to a lot of our clients on who are still on the more legacy or on-premise solutions and what that would look like to bring them to the cloud and providing them advice and a strategic roadmap to move them forward and make sure that they're staying current with the latest technology trends and being set up for the future to be successful. And then lastly, our managed services practice. So for all of our post-go live support, ensuring that our clients are comfortable with their systems, and if they need help or they're having issues, obviously they have an easy mechanism to submit requests and questions to a team here at Elire, and we're able to get them answers and the help that they need in the most time-efficient manner as possible. And finally, to wrap up, before we get into everything payment and ISO related, we have what we refer to as our NASCAR slide here. So you see a lot of clients here across a lot of different industries. Is what we really pride ourselves here on Elire. Having the experience across these different industries to come in, be familiar with the business processes and a lot of the pain points that our clients are having depending on the industry, and being a step or two ahead when we come in to start an engagement and making sure that we can start to analyze those problems and design solutions for them going forward. So first off, like I mentioned, we will start with just some general payment trends here. Firstly, just a word cloud here of a lot of the buzzwords that you'll hear around the payment space and the technology space as it relates to payments these days. A lot of conversation about AI and RPA and automating a lot of these processes. And with that comes a lot of the different cloud solutions that are now being offered, the different formats like ISO and all things related. So you'll hear me touch on a lot of these different items, or at least mention them throughout my presentation today. So first, like I mentioned, a few payment trends here. So by 2023, ISO 20022 will represent 79% of the market value for high value payments and will be 87% of the dollar value. So as you can see, there's been a significant shift in a lot of the more legacy formats. And when I say that, think of at least in the US, you think of your EDI formats or your nacho formats for sending an ACH. A lot of those are slowly but surely fading away, with ISO being an international standard and setting a lot of firms, corporations up for scalability with their payment landscape. So obviously, if you might only be sending domestic payments today, but to have the capabilities to send international to various regions and a lot of different countries in the future, ISO really sets you up to do so. All reserve currencies are live now on ISO 20022 or have declared a live date. So we can see the major currencies there, and I'll have a graphic later in the presentation that shows this adoption by the different regions and by the different currencies and settlement systems across the globe. ISO has been adopted by market infrastructures in 70+ countries, replacing legacy formats. So just to expand further, there's essentially capability for ISO really in any country across the globe. The largest financial institutions and banking partners to the biggest corporations have adopted ISO. They're able to accept those ISO messages, and we've seen within the last 5 to 10 years, especially, as you can see by the adoption rate there, that ISO has spread very quickly and widely across the globe. The US Federal Reserve and CHIPS have delayed their November 2020 start date for ISO 20022 Fedwire adoption to consider a big bang cutover in 2023 rather than a three-phased approach. So the original plan was for the Fedwire here in the States to roll out the first phase of their implementation for ISO this year in November. But rather than piecemealing a lot of the parts of this implementation together, they have decided to put it on hold and have instituted a big bang go live plan for 2023, which I think will be wise, rather than having bits and pieces live here in November, having it delayed and giving them more time to go through testing and vetting of the process. and having that go live set for 2023 now. And then finally, SWIFT ISO global cross-border payments account for 300 billion plus volume in terms of USD on a daily basis. So the ISO format was really founded for the purpose of cross-border payments and to be instituted as an international standard, which I will touch on here quite a bit through the presentation. A couple more trends here. So the SWIFT GPI, or Global Payment Initiative Tracker service, shows that 40% of payments are credited to beneficiaries in 5 minutes or less, and 50% within 30 minutes. So payments are now, with these new technological advances, you're able to move money across the world in a much quicker fashion. And building on that, the ISO 20022 format is the key standard in next generation payment schemes, which includes instant payments moved to 24/7, open banking over APIs, and other items. So I will touch on it, all things related to ISO, but as mentioned there in the bullet, it really is the key payment format or standard for remitting payment across the world, whether it's here in the States, to different regions, or its domestic payments. ISO has it all covered and has the capabilities to do so. 80% of firms are currently transitioning business-to-business payments from paper checks to electronic payments for increased efficiency and reduced costs. So this probably doesn't come as a surprise to too many here on the line, but when you think about the cost to print checks and for postage, along with the time efficiency gains of using electronic payments, escheatment tracking and things like that, a lot of the different business processes and tasks that treasury teams or just financial teams in general go through to track checks and see where they're at, ensure that they get cash and things like that, are a big reason for why the transition to electronic payments has progressed so much here within the last few years. Fraud remains a top concern, with 55% of firms surveyed listing it as the top payment-related challenge that their team faces. This is especially relevant now in our times today. Obviously, with COVID happening here at the beginning of the year, I was reading some studies the other day that from the beginning of February through the end of March, there was between a 700% and 800% increase in payment fraud. And from April of last year to April of this year, there was roughly 1,000% increase in payment fraud. So there's a lot of the more moderate or cloud solutions that are deploying modules within their applications for fraud detection and allowing users to put in place detection rules to trigger alerts to different teams based on different mechanisms of payments within their software. So for example, if you're typically paying a particular vendor, once or twice a month, and all of a sudden you have a third and fourth payment within a month, a lot of these applications are having the ability now to trigger alerts, send them to the applicable people or a group of people, and have them at least do some research or take action where needed. And finally, NACHA requires corporates to protect depository financial institution account numbers by data masking when stored electronically. So if a corporation's volume exceeds 6 million, this will be mandatory by 2021. If your volume exceeds 2 million plus, this will be mandatory by 2022. And then finally, before we get into everything ISO related, just a quick graphic here on what we consider a day in the life for a lot of treasury managers and treasury users. Obviously, as you go through getting in your bank statements, your forecasting and positioning, and today what we're really focusing on will be your payments process, how you initiate any approval workflow behind that, and really being able to utilize the ISO format to standardize these processes. So what is ISO 20022? So ISO is a set of XML message standards across major financial services that is based on a shared data dictionary and business process model. So it was really designed to standardize payments originally, as you can see in the second bullet, across the Eurozone, with SEPA credit transfers beginning in 2008 and SEPA direct debits being instituted in 2009, but it has morphed into much more than that at this point. As pointed out there in the first bullet, it's really a shared data dictionary, which allows, as I've mentioned, for payments to be essentially remitted out of any country and to be sent to any other country across the globe. So when you think about implementing payment processes, it's relatively easy if you're in the United States and you need to send a NACHA ACH file. it's pretty simple to get that up and running. But when you think about sending, potentially a payment from the US to a country in the APAC region with FX involved, there's a lot more complications that come into that. And what ISO was set out to do is sort of standardize that process with enriched data within these files and allow for corporations to have a solution that suits all of their needs and not just some of them, and really be able to house that within one payment gateway and remit payment, from wherever to wherever across the globe that they may need to. It has emerged as a single common language for global financial communications. So all the largest financial institutions and banks have went through quite a heavy testing process and have onboarded the ISO format. So you will see that this is essentially being able to be utilized across all the largest financial institutions and is really being pushed by them for this reason, that it really suits your needs as a corporation and an enterprise across the globe. The ISO format supports high value, think of your wire payments, your low value, so your ACHs or your domestic payments, and also real-time payments. One other cool thing that the ISO format does is it standardizes the use of the unique end-to-end payment reference ID, which returns on the bank statement to optimize your straight-through processing, automated reconciliation of your bank account. So within these files that you're passing, there is an internal ID that is passed from your application that is dictated by your firm that gets passed along to your banking partner, and then will also return on the transaction level of your bank statement. So this really comes in with time efficiency gains on the reconciliation process, because there's an easy mechanism to match payments to what comes back on the statement and save those various teams a lot of time and research effort that they have previously been doing. And then finally, the ISO messages have far fewer payment failures. With this enriched data, you're typically seeing a lot less failures and much more success when you're able to transmit payments either domestic or international. So moving on to an ISO adoption study and where it is at right now as opposed to where it's been, and also where it's going here in the future. So 3 phases planned by SWIFT for the legacy payments transition to ISO. Obviously, the final dates are going to be driven by the users and the banking community. So first is a closed user group, which is typically the banks that are able to use the ISO format. So as you heard me mention, the largest financial institutions really have went through the heavy testing and vetting process of these formats, and that's why they are up to speeds, and they all have their own standards and requirements across those banks. The second phase is a coexistence period with two-way translation. So when you think about corporations sending banking partners payments, they're still able to use the legacy formats like your MT101s and exchange those to the bank, and there's translation capability. So the bank is able to take that MT file, convert it to an ISO file within their back office systems, and then in turn on the acknowledgement file for being passed back, they can take that ISO payment that was converted and convert it back to MT and pass that back to a company so that it obviously adheres to the requirements of the application that they're using. Certainly if ISO 20022 users on both sides are present, they can exchange these messages with one another. But as we've seen, within the last several years, many firms are not as up to speed or caught up with ISO, so they're still using a lot of these legacy formats, MT for international payments, and here in the States, your EDI or your NACHA formats. And then finally, the last phase of the adoption will be full functionality will be ISO only. So your MT messaging will be completely decommissioned once 90% of the funds trafficked has onboarded and is using the ISO format. A quick graphic here on some of the adoptions by region. So as you can see, I talked about ISO originally being designed for EMEA. So as you can see, EMEA is a little bit more up to speed than most of the other regions, especially when it comes to your lower value payments or those SEPA payments. APAC is not far behind, as you can see, for high value and real-time payments, actually being ahead of the curve as compared to EMEA. And then finally, NORAM and America here, we are quite behind. But as I mentioned, with the Fedwire adoption rate, we should see these percentages in terms of corporation adoption increase immensely here within the next 5 years. And the potential impacts for that is if firms aren't able to adopt this ISO format, there will most likely be an increase in fees. So passing a legacy format to your banking partner will force them to convert that file to the ISO format and in turn charge a little bit more fees for doing so. Moving on to an ISO 20022 settlement system adoption here. So as you can see, by currency and settlement system, where the space is at right now across the world. As I mentioned, you can see towards the bottom left there, and in the previous years, the APAC region is much more up to speed and on board, with the European region being just slightly far behind. And then finally, we have the CHIP system, Fedwire, and the primary Canadian settlement system having a plan to be here live within roughly the next 3 to 5 years. As you can see, we should see within the next 2 years or so that everything within APAC and EMEA will be live, and ISO will really be the standard for international payments, replacing those MT files. So most importantly, how can your firm prepare for ISO 20022? So here's a slide based on what we see on a lot of the clients that we go into in terms of their payments business process and a lot of the different things that we recommend. So just from a payment strategy perspective, a lot of the clients that we go into when we first started engagement, we're seeing a decentralized and a localized process. So depending on how many ERP systems or banking relationships that a client has, we're seeing a lot of point-to-point integrations. So whether it's a system connecting to one bank or multiple banks, or if there's multiple back office systems all connecting to that bank, which obviously drives up the cost for connectivity, but it also makes it very segregated and a fragmented process. So you don't have visibility as a whole into the payments that are being executed, where they're coming from, and you're also paying for all those different integrations. And what we often recommend is a centralization and a centralized payment factory. So going from those point-to-point integrations that I mentioned to more of a hub strategy of integrating all of these payments within one central location from a systematic perspective, and then utilizing a format like the ISO format because it can suit all of your needs, regardless of the nature and the scope of the payments that you're implementing. ISO is really going to allow for scalability and growth for your organization. From a workflow and processes standpoint, it's oftentimes very similar concepts to what I just mentioned. So a lot of different processes, not much standardization, and it's very manual. So a lot of labor-intensive activities are going on across various teams within an organization. And what having a centralized payment gateway or factory is going to do for you as a firm is it's going to allow you to create more uniform processes, implement system integrated controls. So house all of your payment approval workflow within one system or one application, and do more with less. So moving, going from multiple people touching different items within multiple systems, housing that within a system, and having the visibility across your applications and all of your different payments. And then finally, the payments landscape normalization. So just from a business process perspective, we're typically seeing a lot of banks and accounts, which in turn results in various e-banking portals being used where users are having to log in. We all know the pains that can come with logging into a banking portal and token access and such. And that's a primary reason for why we are really pushing for these ISO payment gateways and a centralized payment factory. And in turn with that, as you can see there for our future state recommendations with the payment landscape, I'm really doing a bank rationalization assessment, looking at your bank account model, your banking structure, making sure that it's suiting your needs, but that you are also simplifying that to reduce, fees for bank accounts that may not be necessary, and also reducing your dependency on these banking portals. So having the capability to reduce your licenses that may be required from a banking portal perspective, and moving this to more of a treasury management system or a centralized location within an application. Moving on to a standard ISO project methodology. So very similar here to what we follow at Elire. We like to break this out in phases. So we start with our mobilization phase. So this is really just getting the project up and running. The one thing that I will preach is to always engage your banking partners as soon as possible. We've all probably been at the mercy of working with banks and adhering to their timelines. So we like to engage them as soon as possible, make sure that they have some adequate time to get all the resources on their end lined up, project managers, integration specialists, and things like that for once we get into more of the heavy testing and integration with the ISO format. After that, we move into what I would consider the most important phase of any project, ISO related, would be our design. So this is really going to be about cataloging all of our requirements, nailing down our scope, which is typically the most important thing, is having some facilitated conversations about what we're actually trying to accomplish and putting some priorities behind that. So are we keeping these as domestic payments? Are we doing international? If so, which countries are we remitting payment out of? What are our different payment types or different payment methods, and so on? So the design phase is always very important as we move through any project to ensure that we don't leave anything out and we don't have any gotchas later within the project that we didn't quite document earlier. So like I said, I typically consider this to be the most important phase before going into the build and the test phase. Once we have all those decisions made, documented, finalized, and approved by all of our key stakeholders, we move into the build phase. So this is really going to be about configuring our applications, attaching these various ISO layouts to different bank accounts across your structure, and making sure that it looks like we have all of our data lined up to ensure that we adhere to all of our different banking and country requirements once we start testing these files. Once this is done, we move into that test phase. So this involves sending various payments to our banking partners, getting a lot of feedback from them. So this is typically going to be a bit of a time-consuming process depending on the scope. If you're doing international payments with a lot of different methods, there's going to be feedback that you get where there's errors within the file where you have to analyze, whether it's coming from an ERP application or a TMS application. You have to analyze the data elements that are feeding your ISO files and ensure that you are able to pass the adequate data to your banking partners so that they can obviously process those files within their system, and ensure that once you are going to move to production, you won't have any sudden errors or payment failures that come up. And then finally, our deploy stage. So going live here with these ISO files, this first starts with our pen testing. So just really building on our test phase, we like to send these very low value payments to ensure that our file structure is still in place after our migration to production has taken place, executing any of our cutover strategies or points that we had, and then finally moving into our stabilized process. So providing post-go live support where needed, making sure that business users are comfortable with these processes, and making sure that all scenarios have been adequately tested to ensure us for future success. And finally, here's just a bit of a graphic on kind of what we're seeing for these various payment factories that we're implementing utilizing the ISO format. So on the left, when we're going into a lot of our clients, we're seeing various disparate source systems. So as I mentioned, you may have multiple ERP applications or just other back office systems where payments are being initiated, and there's those point-to-point integrations directly with those banking partners. So as you can see here, we have our financial or our payment gateway in the center that is really centralizing this process. If this wasn't there, you would see arrows from all of your different source systems to those different banking partners, which, like I mentioned, can be a really big pain from a development standpoint, having to create a layout for each different banking partner and each different payment type to send those to your bank, but also from a cost perspective of paying for that connectivity to each financial institution from all of your different source systems. So what we like to do is take all of the different payment requests from these source systems and move these into a payment gateway and use, a centralized payment format like ISO to house all of this information, do a transformation of the data. So to make sure all of your wiring instructions on the beneficiary side include the proper information based on the payment type, in terms of if it's domestic. If you think here in the United States, we're using ABA for routing numbers. When you're sending international payments, you're using your SWIFT codes typically for those. So housing that all within one application or one payment factory allows this data transformation to happen seamlessly. And what it does is we are then able to connect just this one system or application to all of the different banking partners, a huge reduction in cost, but also just from a business process standpoint and a visibility of cash, you're able to see this activity in a much more time efficient manner. Once we have all these payments integrated, obviously they're being sent to your banking partners. And then on the flip side, those acknowledgments are coming back. We have easy visibility into the status of those payments. So we're able to track them essentially throughout the life cycle of the bank. So once they get sent to the bank, has that file been received? And then in turn, as the last step, has that payment been accepted or rejected by the banking partner? Another thing to point out within these gateways is ensuring that your bank's and account setup is correct so that they include all the proper information being sent, like I mentioned, in terms of just account numbers, routing numbers, wiring instructions, and such. You can see where ISO comes into this is within this payment gateway. ISO is really the backbone in terms of formatting. Like I mentioned, it is suited for really any needs that any corporation might have across the globe. So there's tons of different payment types within various countries across the world, but the enriched data model that sits behind the ISO format allows for, when you think about IBANs being used within the European region, as opposed to just your standard bank account numbers in the NORAM and the APAC regions, ISO has the capability to handle all this information, pass it to the banks so that they can accept it. And obviously you can have this payment gateway that sits in the middle and is able to suit all your needs as a business. So moving on to a couple of ISO project examples that we have done here at Elire. So the first one, just a couple tidbits about the client, the industry here, banking and credit card issuance. The regions where they're doing business, as you can see, pretty global, USA, Canada, and Europe, and about 20,000 employees with some assets and revenue figures there. So a few of the main tasks that we undertook on this project. So first, selecting our ISO formats that are in scope and gathering the bank requirements for these. So as I mentioned, as part of the design phase, really the most important thing is going to be documenting and finalizing all of your different payment types across which countries. And then once this is done, typically what we like to do is work backwards, as you can see here, mapped from the banking requirement ISO standards. So taking the spec documents that we get from each of the banking partners and relating those various data elements back to whether it's an ERP or a TMS system, and ensuring that we're going to be able to pass the proper values and the proper information for the banks to accept these files and process these payments. The biggest undertaking typically with this is our vendor master data cleanup. So ensuring that where applicable, we have full address information. That is something that the banks will typically flag as required. So ensuring that we have that full address information included, that our pay from and to accounts are completely scrubbed and the data is accurate. So like I mentioned, for international payments, ensuring that we are able to pass a SWIFT code, as opposed to when you're passing domestic payments, not only here in the US, but also in a lot of different countries, you're gonna see that local routing numbers are used. So we use our ABAs here within the US. When you think about like BACS payments within the UK, they have a local sorting code as well. So making sure that from your bank account standpoint, if you have an account that is going to be remitting domestic and international payments, that you can store all of these data elements and ensure that it's passed accordingly to what you're trying to do with that payment. The accounts payable ISO setup, so ensuring that we have all of our pay cycles set up, was one of our key processes in this process, making sure that payments were created and generated from the AP module and pushed to our centralized payment factory. As you can see, a couple different payment types that we had and which teams were responsible and how those were going to be executed. So for low value payments, so essentially domestic ACH payments within the same currency, those were just created on an automated fashion by these pay cycles within the ERP application. Our high value are our wire payments made in bank accounts where the currency is not the same. So essentially our FX transfers initiated by the treasury team. And then the low value payments to the Asia Pacific region with non-English characters initiated in the bank portal. This is fairly common when you move to the APAC region. If you're remitting payment and doing domestic payments there, you're going to see quite a bit that they have some pretty intricate local language character requirements. So we do see a lot of clients that are keeping these within the banking portal just for ease of implementation and time efficiency gains. I will say that a lot of the more modern cloud systems and modern ERP cloud applications have full capabilities to pass these characters and are able to translate them to their banking partners, and they can certainly use the ISO format to do so. And then more of the ad hoc or immediate wire payments to be initiated or by the Treasury team as well. One thing to point out, as you can see by the last bullet, the ability to create alerts in advance for payments that may cause repair, or in other words, may fail at the bank. So we were able to create alerts before payments were remitted to the bank on a couple of different criteria. So as you can see there, if the bank account currency and the payment currency were not the same, we had the Treasury team be notified so that they could at least go put eyes on that payment, ensure that everything was entered correctly before going to the bank and potentially, like I mentioned, having a failure there. And then if your pay date and your value date were different, we were also able to create an alert there and follow that same process for individuals to investigate before that payment actually went out the door to the bank. So a quick process flow here based on a lot of the activities that we went through on this project. So as you can see, starting here in the top swim lane, this was a lot of our data scrubbing on the Treasury side for the bank account model of this client that we worked with. So ensuring that all of their own bank accounts were set up accordingly. Like I mentioned, all address information was included where it needed to be. All of the wiring instructions in terms of the routing numbers and the bank account numbers were accurate. And then also attaching our ISO layouts to these bank accounts. So ensuring that all of the different tags within the XML file would translate once it's created and sent to the bank. Moving to the second swim lane was more, like I mentioned, on the vendor side. So doing the maintenance of these vendors and their bank account information, ensuring that we have, once again, all of the necessary information that we need, populating these addresses and the various payment instructions that went into this. And then finally, once the payments are initiated, as you can see in the bottom swim lane, was really housing them within a centralized payment gateway. So regardless of if they were AP payments or they were Treasury payments, or they were payments even coming from various back office systems, they were all coming to one system before being released to the bank. Easy visibility for the Treasury team to lay eyes on these payments, make sure everything looks all right, and also institute some approval workflows behind that where necessary before passing these along. So ISO project number 2, we had a cloud cash management and global payments implementation. Once again, just some various statistics here on the client that we worked with. So as I mentioned, this was a cloud implementation. So just a couple highlights here on kind of the background of the project. So moving from an on-premise application to the cloud. So you see you have your public cloud where you're in various applications. You can be in a multi-tenant architecture where various clients are sharing the same database or the same application provided, but they all have their own instance. And also your private cloud applications where you have your own dedicated instance of the application. It is customizable, whereas when you think about the public cloud, not customizable, all controlled by configuration. But regardless, the biggest difference from these on-premise solutions is you're staying on the latest version. So your IT support model is reduced quite a bit. Sorry about that. Is reduced quite a bit because all clients are on the same instance that is managed by the service provider or the application vendor. In this case, like I mentioned, we were moving from the on-premise application to the cloud with a bit of a hybrid model from an ERP to a TMS standpoint, ensuring that we were able to meet requirements on the payment side. And from just a business user perspective, you can see the various cloud models here when you think about your infrastructure as a service, versus your platform as a service, and then ultimately, and mainly what we're working with from an end user standpoint is your software as a service. So the capabilities from these different cloud models, as you can see called out, with access to the entire platform within your infrastructure as a service provider, the application and enhancements, and that delineates down as you move ultimately to your software as a service, where your business end user just has access to the application. Like I mentioned, not customizable. It's all controlled by configuration, which can be a scary thought for a lot of clients that are coming from a highly customized on-premise application. But many of these modern cloud applications are built to meet business requirements, depending on what they might be, and also just have built-in configuration items to suffice for these various requirements. And then finally, some of the realized benefits here of both of these projects, and I think this is a key slide to hone in on. And from a payments perspective, what we mainly see is really this increased efficiency. So reducing your manual processing and cutting down on your bank portal user license. Like I mentioned, especially from an international perspective, having to go into various banking portals, going through the hassle of logging in and initiating payments within those is not very time friendly. The way that I think about, if an ISO implementation or migration is good for corporations is the more complex your organization is and the payment landscape behind that is the more value that you're even going to see from an ISO implementation or migration, in terms of using a centralized payment factory to house all of this information within one place, having that visibility to these payments that are leaving, where they're going, enhanced reporting behind that and such. Another thing that we typically see here from an efficiency standpoint is integration with other financial submodules. So being able to bring in your AP payments on a daily basis into a payment factory before dispersing to the bank, and ultimately having a system and a format that is suited for global electronic payments. But what we have realized throughout a lot of these projects is they do bleed into other work streams, as you can see. So improved reporting and forecasting is one of the big ones. Real-time visibility via dashboards and a lot of the business intelligence that is implemented in the cloud applications is something where you're able to see a lot of the info that a lot of executives didn't even know before they have implemented a centralized payment factory. So where are you initiating payments from? Where are they going? And so on and so forth, and also having visibility intraday to your cash, which allows ultimately for you to make better investment decisions and so on from a treasury perspective. Improved bank management, so just making sure that your data is all scrubbed and clean from a bank branch and account setup. You can see that on these projects we onboarded at a minimum 3 banks, and we're able to do so in a relatively timely manner, get electronic bank statements up and running very quickly. And then finally, at the top right here, a better audit trail and control points. So a single system of record that's auditable, moving, like I mentioned, fragmented approval workflow processes within the one application, and having all applicable users have visibility into where all of these payments are at from conception to completion. Quick slide here on some of the cloud payment vendors. As you can see, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar. You have your Kyrebas and your G-Treasuries as more of these standalone TMS systems. And then you can see some of like the Oracle Cloud and the FIS who offer your enterprise-wide ERP applications with a cash management module built in to remit payment out of as well. So finally, here's some of the ROI and TCO benefits that we see on these projects. So first, as I've mentioned, ISO Payments Gateway is going to lower your risk from a regulatory perspective, but also operational. So those efficiency gains that I've talked about from an operational perspective, reducing the time burden for users to be navigating to multiple different portals or systems and moving that into a centralized application makes it much easier on them. And then just from an audit and a regulatory perspective, you have visibility to all your data within one centralized location. ISO Payments Gateway is going to improve your funding of intraday liquidity. So as I mentioned, you have much more visibility into where your cash is at throughout the day. And in turn, why this is important is because it's going to allow you to make better investment decisions and make sure that your cash throughout your bank account model is where it needs to be. And if not, you are able to obviously adjust accordingly. ISO Payments Gateway is going to lower your cost of reporting and improve analytics. So as I mentioned, just really having access to this information. A lot of our clients are, shocked after we do these implementations at just how much more information they have at their fingertips based on these payment gateways that we're implementing. It lowers your cost of reporting. Like I mentioned, that's really just the time cost of having to go to various systems and locations to pull this information. And from an analytical perspective, using a lot of your visual or graphical business intelligence within these applications to figure out, where your money is going, and in turn do some analysis and make sure that your business process is where it needs to be. And finally, automates the workflow approval process. So as I've touched on, moving that within one location, ensuring that all users have access and can follow payments from conception to completion. Mobile review and approvals on iPhone, iPad, and Android. So this is becoming more and more common. A lot of software vendors here within the payment space are getting more and more up to speed. You will see some that already have a mobile application up and running where you have a lot of your payment approvers maybe out in the field are traveling quite a bit, so they're not always sitting at a desk with a PC in front of them, and this allows them to seamlessly log into an iPhone or an iPad, see all of the payment details that they typically would, and then obviously take action as they need to. Easier integration of subsidiary and acquisition payments. So when you think about a lot of the M&A implications here, having this centralized system will allow for seamless integration when it comes to acquisitions and such. And that bleeds into, as you can see, the next bullet point, ease of implementation for payments on behalf of and shared service centers. And then finally reduces the number of bank accounts and fees. So as I mentioned, rather than having, from a connectivity standpoint, point-to-point integrations, moving this all to a more of a hub perspective and integrating payments into a centralized payment factory using the ISO format to format all of your payments and send them to your banking partners leads to a pretty big and substantial reduction in the number of fees that you'll see implemented across your banking partners. And then finally, the technical support costs for a singular ISO approach are significantly lower and reduces operational risk. So as I mentioned, the IT support model that sits behind a lot of, especially these more modern cloud applications, it allows for the service provider or that actual application vendor to own the support. So you don't have a singular IT team that's dedicated to supporting an application and ensuring from a payments perspective that all of your ISO formats are developed accordingly. It's a huge time savings to kind of outsource that to an application vendor. Ability to consolidate on the number and types of bank connections. So I've said this several times here, but having an ERP system or multiple ERP systems in combination with a few other back office systems that are all directly connected to your banking partners. You can think about how the number of those connections can ramp up pretty quickly. If you have 3 to 4 systems across anywhere from 5 to 10 banking partners, you're going to be paying for each of those direct connections. So we're able to take those different ERP back office systems, integrate all of that payment activity into one application, utilize the ISO format from a payment file perspective, but that leads to one system connected to several banks rather than several systems connected to several banks. And that obviously is going to have a huge impact on the fees that you're paying as well. Reduction in file transfer fees by consolidating into fewer files. So typically banking partners are going to charge by the amount of payment files that you send. With the ISO format, you can send payment methods and various locations all within one file. So you're not needing to segregate all these files and send them separately to your banking partners. And obviously when you go from 3 to 4 to 5 systems that are remitting payment and sending files to banks to one system that is sending just a few files to your banking partners, you're going to see a significant decrease in those fees. Significantly improves your straight-through processing bank reconciliation using that end-to-end payment ID. So once again, that internal reference that is being remitted to your banking partners within the ISO payment files will return on your bank statements for an easy automatic reconciliation. So we've seen a lot of our clients, the hit rate for this automatic reconciliation and the time that their teams are having to put in to deal with exception handling from a reconciliation perspective is significantly decreased. Simplifies global funds transfers across borders. So that was really the backbone of the ISO approach, was not so much as for the domestic payments where you have your proprietary formats across the globe, but to simplify this process for sending money from one country to whatever other country in whatever region you might need to. And then finally, from an audit perspective, you have your OFAC and anti-money laundering that can be centralized more easily to improve oversight, automate alerts, and increase the capabilities of your regulatory and audit reporting. And in turn, the risk of these OFAC and AML exceptions is then significantly reduced. So like I mentioned, a lot of applications are developing or have already developed payment fraud modules that allow you to implement detection rules to basically flag any activity that doesn't seem to fall within the norm of your business processes. So ensuring that people are notified when something seems to stray from the normal for what your payment activity looks like, ensuring that people are at least able to get eyes on this activity and then in turn investigate and act accordingly. And that wraps up the presentation. Jordan, I believe we're going to move to our Q&A session.
Yes, and we do actually have quite a few questions coming in here. Since we only have a couple of minutes, we most likely won't be able to get to all of them, but feel free to keep submitting them. If there are quite a few, we'll send them out in a separate document that we for the ones that we don't get to. So first question, ACH activity is protected or is to be protected by 2021 or 2022. Is the intention for this to be transmitting data only or masking of all our company's ACH data sources, so email, imaging, etc.?
So that's a good question. It's supposed to be for when it's stored electronically. So obviously for transmitting data, but also within your own applications to ensure that just from a security standpoint and data integrity, that this data is masked whenever it is stored electronically.
Excellent. And next question, you mentioned centralizing payments by hub. Presumably this would be country hubs to avoid tax implications. I guess that's the question.
So when I talk about a payment hub, more from a systemic standpoint, so centralizing your payments regardless of what countries they might be initiated from within one system. So you're not having your local teams within the Asia Pacific region who are using different systems to initiate those payments as opposed to other teams that you may have across different regions in the world. So being able to consolidate all of those within one application, it really improves your visibility, and also from a cost perspective, as I mentioned several times, it's going to drive that way down.
And last one that we'll be able to get to. So early on in the presentation, you mentioned 80% of firms converting to electronic payments from paper. How much of that 80% is being driven by the COVID experience?
Sure, that's a good question. I think, that trend was really taking place before COVID even hit, but COVID certainly has a profound effect on that as well. I think over the last several years, checks in general have just been being slowly but surely kind of removed as a valid treasury payment method. We're seeing more and more corporations trying to get off of check payment methods to move to electronic payments just because of, like I mentioned, the increased efficiencies from a time perspective, but also the reduction in costs.
Excellent. And with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up this session. The link to the CTP CCM assessment for this session is in the chat right now, as well as it will be sent out in a follow-up with the recording of the session. Our next session that we have is how COVID-19 broke the conventional cash visibility model. That's going to start at 10 a.m. Central, and that session is available for CTP CCM credits as well. Thank you, Mike, for your time today, and everyone on the line. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.